Hello, and welcome back to WW2 Tales. Today we're going to dive into one of the most remarkable yet largely forgotten stories of World War II. A story that changed the course of history not through warfare, but through something far more powerful: the sheer force of industrial abundance and unexpected kindness. The year is June 1943. Picture this. A train pulls into a small Texas town called Mexia, carrying 1,850 German soldiers fresh from the defeated Afrika Korps. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were battle-hardened veterans who'd driven the British back to Egypt, who'd earned the grudging respect of Montgomery himself. They expected prisoner camps. What they found would shatter everything Nazi propaganda had taught them about America, about their own nation, and about themselves. This is the story of how American industrial might, combined with a commitment to treating enemies with dignity, became the most effective weapon against Nazi ideology that anyone could have. Imagined, not through bombs or bullets, but through the overwhelming evidence of what a free society could achieve. Understanding the propaganda they had been taught to understand the shock that hit German prisoners when they arrived in America, we must first understand what they had been taught. For years, the Nazi regime had systematically propagandized the supposed weakness and decadence of America. Hitler himself had predicted that American industrial production was propaganda, an impossible fantasy designed to intimidate potential enemies. German soldiers had been told repeatedly that America was a nation on the verge of collapse, riven by class conflict, weakened by racial diversity, led by incompetent politicians. German military leadership, despite evidence to the contrary, dismissed American production claims as exaggerated propaganda. When American leaders set production targets that seemed fantastically high, claims that the nation would produce 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943, German military intelligence dismissed these as lies. It was impossible. No nation could organize itself to achieve such production. Surely the Americans were lying to intimidate potential enemies. The Führer had stated with confidence that Germany would ultimately defeat America. German soldiers were told that despite any temporary setbacks, German racial superiority, German efficiency, and German determination would ultimately prevail. American soldiers were undisciplined. American military equipment was poorly made. American industry was inefficient. These were the foundational beliefs of the German soldier. German domestic life had been shaped by scarcity since the Nazi regime began rearmament in the 1930s. Consumer goods were restricted, food was rationed, luxury items were unavailable. Everything was subordinated to military production. Germans sacrificed their standard of living for the war effort. This sacrifice was presented as noble. Germans were working for the future of the thousand-year Reich. Rural electrification in Germany had lagged far behind America. While 90% of American farms had electricity by 1943, fewer than 20% of German farms had reliable electric power. German farmers still relied heavily on animal labor and manual work. The idea of mechanized agriculture producing yields far above what German farmers achieved seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The scale of an unprecedented operation. Before we get to those German soldiers stepping off that train, let me set the stage for just how massive this operation was. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States became home to over 425,000 enemy prisoners of war. Somewhere around 371,000 of those were German soldiers. Think about that number for a moment. Nearly 500,000 enemy combatants spread across more than 500 camps in 45 different states. Every state except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont housed German POWs. This wasn't a small experimental program. It was one of the largest military operations ever conducted entirely on the home front. The first significant wave of German prisoners arrived in the spring of 1943, following the stunning collapse of the Afrika Korps in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered somewhere between 250,000 and 275,000 German and Italian soldiers when the campaign ended. About 30,000 German soldiers a month began arriving in America during 1943, transported in Liberty ships that would otherwise have sailed back empty from Europe. These weren't cattle cars or freight containers. They were passenger vessels, Pullman coaches with dining services and sleeping berths. The Geneva Convention required it, and the Americans honored those requirements scrupulously. The logistical challenge was staggering. The U.S. military had to rapidly construct or convert existing facilities to house these men. They built 175 main camps and 325 branch camps. Some camps were completed in as little as 90 days. The camps ranged from small operations with just a few hundred prisoners to massive installations like Camp Carson in Colorado, which held 12,000 men at its peak. Most camps were deliberately placed in the South and Southwest, cheaper to heat, further from industrial centers, and in areas experiencing acute labor shortages due to men leaving farms and factories to join the military or work in war industries. What made this story so extraordinary wasn't just the scale of the operation, but what it revealed about America when viewed through the eyes of soldiers who'd been taught to despise the country. The shock begins. From capture to the Atlantic. Let's follow one of our prisoners to understand this journey better. We know the general experience from dozens of prisoner accounts, letters, diaries, and post-war interviews. A typical German soldier captured in North Africa would have experienced something like this. First came the capture itself. After months of fighting in the desert, after the final collapse of German resistance in Tunisia, thousands of German soldiers suddenly became prisoners. The experience was disorienting. These were men accustomed to commanding, to being part of the master race, according to Nazi ideology. Now they were defeated. Some feared what would happen next. Nazi propaganda had been clear about what the enemy would do with German prisoners. It would be brutal, they'd been told. It would be dehumanizing. Instead, what they encountered was something their minds struggled to process. American soldiers who treated them with professional courtesy, medical examinations conducted with care, identity cards photographed and filed with bureaucratic precision. What struck many of them immediately was American efficiency, not the cold, militaristic efficiency of the Wehrmacht, but a businesslike, matter-of-fact approach to processing thousands of prisoners daily. And then came the food. Oberfuhrer Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, recorded his amazement. In the cage at Oran, while we waited for ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. The first thought in many prisoners' minds was that this must be propaganda, a deliberate effort to impress them. Surely this couldn't be standard military rations. But American guards, with a shrug that spoke volumes, assured them this was normal, just standard American military food. The crossing of the Atlantic in the summer of 1943 provided what we might call the first phase of what one historian termed ideological collapse syndrome. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a detailed account in letters home after repatriation. He was astonished by the food waste. The ship's crew, he noted, disposed of more food waste each day than his entire company had received in weekly rations during the final months fighting in Africa. The American sailors threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk that had sat too long, Zimmermann wrote. What struck him most was that they did this openly, without thought, not to mock us, but because to them this waste meant nothing. Their supply was limitless. The ship itself became a floating classroom in American industrial power. Prisoners learned that the vessel carrying them was one of 2,010 Liberty ships that would be constructed during the war, each one requiring 250,000 individual parts. The engines alone were manufactured in 3 separate factories, each producing 900 horsepower cylinders that were then assembled in ports that had barely existed 2 years earlier. These weren't bespoke, handcrafted vessels built for specific purposes. They were standardized ships, mass-produced in quantities that seemed impossible. One of every hour, American shipyards were turning them out. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stauberg, an aristocratic Prussian officer whose family had served in German wars since Frederick the Great, would later write in his memoirs about watching the radar antenna rotating above the ship's bridge as they approached American waters. This technology, which we believed only we and perhaps the British possessed in limited quantities, was standard equipment on a cargo vessel, he wrote. It was then I first suspected that Germany had already lost the war. The arrival and the first shock, August 2nd, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The first sight of America shattered the last remaining vestiges of Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness. The Norfolk base sprawled across 4,300 acres, docks stretching for miles, cranes loading and unloading dozens of ships simultaneously. In a single day, this one port handled more tonnage than the entire German port of Hamburg managed in a week. Gefreiter Jon Eber, a factory worker from the Ruhr before his conscription, walked off the ship and immediately started counting. He recorded in his secret diary that he saw 47 cargo ships in various stages of loading or unloading. Each crane, he noted, lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horses in Germany. They moved with electric power, smoothly, continuously, without the coal smoke that choked German industrial cities. But it wasn't just the industrial infrastructure that shocked them. As the prisoners were formed into columns for the march to waiting trains, they passed parking lots filled with civilian automobiles. Hundreds of them. These belonged to dock workers. In Germany, private automobile ownership was a privilege reserved for the wealthy and Nazi Party elite. The Volkswagen, promised to the German people since 1934 as the people's car, remained essentially a propaganda dream. Fewer than 1,000 were ever delivered to civilians before and during the war. Here, ordinary laborers drove to work in their own cars. And then came the trains, not boxcars, not the notorious 40 and 8 wagons. So, called because they could hold either 40 men or 8 horses, that had carried German troops across Europe. These were full passenger coaches, Pullman cars with padded seats that converted to sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, observation cars with panoramic windows. Hedman Radke, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, wrote, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners." The American guard seemed almost embarrassed by the comfort. One sergeant actually apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly in their car. Air conditioning, in August. These men had believed such luxury existed only in Hitler's personal train, if anywhere at all. The 3-day journey that changed everything. What happened over the next 3 days as those trains rolled from Norfolk through Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and into Georgia, Tennessee, and finally to Texas, would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any military defeat. As the trains rolled through the American night, the prisoners pressed their faces against windows, witnessing an America that couldn't possibly exist, according to everything they had been taught. The journey was meticulously documented in prisoner accounts. These weren't casual observations. Men kept secret diaries, writing with trembling hands about what they were seeing. Some felt compelled to record every detail, as if knowing that others back home would never believe what they were witnessing. The experience was almost dreamlike. They were prisoners behind armed guards, yet they were traveling in comfort through a land of such obvious abundance that it challenged their entire understanding of reality. What struck them first and most persistently was the light. American towns and cities at night were blazing with illumination. To men who had grown up in Germany during the 1920s and 1930s, who had experienced blackout regulations since 1940, who knew that electricity was rationed and precious, this endless constellation of lights seemed almost supernatural. Every small town blazed with illumination. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro. Communities that in Germany would have been lucky to have a single electric street lamp displayed illuminated shop windows, electric signs, houses with lights burning in multiple rooms. The trains passed factories running night shifts, their windows glowing. Parking lots full even at midnight. Obergefreiter Mayer, whose father was a Nazi Party block leader in Hamburg, later wrote a letter that somehow made it past the American censors. "We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Everyone had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards told us this was normal, that every American town had electricity since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He just shrugged and said we would see." At a station in Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. The prisoners watched American railway workers perform in 30 minutes what would have taken 2 hours in Germany. Automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, mechanized lubrication systems. Every aspect of the operation demonstrated technological superiority, that wasn't even trying to demonstrate anything. This was just how things were done in America. What disturbed the Germans even more was the casual wealth of the workers themselves. They wore leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months of wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and threw the empties into bins without thought. They smoked cigarettes continuously, stubbing them out half-finished, still mostly unsmoked. Feldwebel Hinrich Müller, an electrical engineer from Bremen before the war, calculated that the single railway yard they stopped in consumed more electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin used in a single day. The waste was magnificent, he wrote. They left lights burning in empty buildings. Electric fans ran in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resource. As the trains crossed into Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners encountered American industrial power in its full, overwhelming display. Through the windows, they watched endless factories, each one larger than anything most of them had seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched for 3 miles along the river. Its electric furnaces consumed 175,000 kilowatts of power, more electricity than the entire city of Munich consumed. Near Louisville, the trains slowed as they passed the Rubbertown complex, where synthetic rubber plants had been built from empty fields in just 18 months. 4 massive facilities, each employing thousands of workers, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany had invented the process and could never managed more than 120,000 tons in its best year. Oberfuhrer Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, understood the implications immediately. In a post-war interview, he recalled, "I knew those plants. I could see the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers. Each facility was more advanced than anything we had built, and there were 4 of them just in this one location. They told us there were dozens more across the country." And then came Ford's Willow Run. The monument to industrial capacity, Willow Run and American aviation. The trains passed Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, visible from miles away. This single factory, built in just 9 months, represented something that had seemed impossible to the Germans. In April 1944, this plant achieved a production rate of 1 finished B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 63 minutes. Every hour, on the hour, day and night, another 4-engine bomber rolled off the assembly line, ready for flight testing and delivery. The factory itself was vast, 3.5 million square feet of manufacturing space, making it one of the largest buildings in the world at the time. At its peak, it employed over 42,000 workers. The assembly line stretched for a mile long, with 2 parallel lines working simultaneously to maximize production capacity. To solve a tax problem involving county boundaries, Ford engineers had installed massive turntables that rotated partially assembled bombers at a 90-degree angle. The aircraft literally turned a corner without stopping production. These became known as the tax turns, a remarkable engineering solution to a bureaucratic challenge. Each B-24 contained 1,150,000 individual parts, manufactured by 1,500 different subcontractors spread across the country. The engines alone had to be built to incredibly precise specifications and installed perfectly for the aircraft to function. The entire assembly process was a marvel of industrial coordination. Raw materials flowed in from hundreds of suppliers. Subassemblies were manufactured in different states and trucked to Willow Run for final assembly. The coordination required would have seemed impossible years earlier. In total, Willow Run would produce 8,685 B-24 bombers before production ended in May 1945, nearly half of all Liberators built during the entire war. This single plant, built from farmland that had belonged to Henry Ford personally, became the embodiment of American industrial capability during wartime. Hauptmann Verily, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the window as they passed. He counted 17 B-24s in various stages of completion, visible from the train. "We had been told American planes were inferior, hastily built, would fall apart in combat," he later wrote. "But I could see the precision of the assembly lines, the quality of the construction. These were not inferior aircraft. They were simply built faster than we could imagine possible." Think about what that meant to a German officer. The Nazi regime had told him that American manufacturing was inferior, that American engineering was sloppy, that American aircraft were death traps. Yet here, visible from a moving train, was irrefutable evidence that this was all a lie. Not just a small lie, but a massive, fundamental lie about the nature of the conflict itself. German aircraft production never approached American levels. Germany produced approximately 3,600 fighters and bombers in 1943, their peak year. America would ultimately produce over 300,000 military aircraft during the war. Germany had committed to aircraft production relatively late, had experienced bombing damage that disrupted manufacturing, and never achieved the scale of coordinated subcontracting that Ford had pioneered with Willow Run. The breadbasket of the world. As the trains penetrated deeper into America, the nature of the shock shifted. The prisoners had seen factories, ports, and infrastructure. Now they would see agriculture on a scale their minds could barely process. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River while barges below them carried more grain than the entire German harvest of 1942. Grain elevators stretched along both banks of the river, each one holding enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote in his diary, "The Americans transport food as we transport ammunition, in endless quantities without concern for loss. I watched them loading a single barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with meat thicker than our weekly ration." In Kansas City, the train stopped at a massive stockyard where tens of thousands of cattle waited for slaughter. The smell of meatpacking plants filled the air for miles. German POWs who had subsisted on 200 grams of meat per week in North Africa, when they were lucky, watched American workers eating beef sandwiches during their lunch breaks. "They ate meat like we ate bread," wrote Gefreiter Paul Fischer. "No, that's wrong. They ate meat like we wished we could eat bread." His description of a simple moment crystallizes the shock. The guard bought us hamburgers from a stand near the station, meat, cheese, vegetables on white bread for a nickel. He bought 20 of them without thinking, paid with a single dollar bill. This was not special. This was their normal food. Imagine being a German soldier who'd spent years eating thin soup and black bread, rationed and measured, watching everything go to feed the war machine. Now you're seeing an American railway worker casually buy 20 hamburgers on a whim, spend less in money than you earned in a day, and think nothing of it. It's not a dramatic moment. It's not even particularly remarkable by American standards. But to a German soldier conditioned by Nazi ideology and wartime privation, it was absolutely staggering. The reality of the camps and the shock of comfort. In August 1943, the first groups of German prisoners began arriving at their assigned camps. Camp Hearn in Texas would become one of the largest, housing between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners. It had been built in just 4 months, yet another feat of American construction efficiency that astounded the prisoners. The speed alone defied German understanding. In Germany, a project of this magnitude would take years of planning and bureaucratic approval. Here it had been conceived and constructed in 4 months. What they found were conditions that exceeded what most of them had known even as civilians before the war. Wooden barracks with electric lights in every room, flush toilets, a luxury that many German soldiers had never experienced even in their own homes. Hot showers, steam heat. For men who had spent years in the North African desert with minimal sanitation, who had known cold barracks in Germany, who had been promised nothing by their own military, this was almost incomprehensible. The camp hospital particularly astounded the medical personnel among the prisoners. Oberstleutnant Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Infantry Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. The equipment available was state-of-the-art: X-ray machines, surgical tools, pharmaceutical supplies that had been unavailable in Germany since 1941. They had penicillin, Dr. Bauer would later testify, this miracle drug that we had only heard rumors about. They used it freely, even on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying for want of basic sulfur drugs, and the Americans were giving us their most advanced medicine without hesitation. The implications were staggering. American military resources were so abundant that they could afford to treat enemy prisoners with their most advanced pharmaceutical weapons. The camp kitchen became another classroom in American prosperity. Prisoners assigned to cooking duties discovered walk-in refrigerators, massive metal boxes that kept food fresh indefinitely, electric mixers that could process hundreds of pounds of dough, automated dishwashers that could clean dishes in minutes instead of hours of hand labor, gas ranges that could prepare meals for 5,000 men with remarkable efficiency. The daily ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, quantities that German civilians hadn't seen since 1939. For years, Germans had endured substitute coffee made from roasted grains, margarine instead of butter, bread rationed to specific amounts. Here, prisoners were receiving nutrition that would have been considered luxurious even before the war. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich who had worked in prestigious establishments before conscription, found himself weeping while performing his duties. "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years," he wrote in a letter that somehow survived the censors. Not spoiled food, simply excess. The American regulations require we prepare 10% more than needed to ensure every prisoner receives full rations. The surplus is discarded. He continued, "I wept as I threw perfectly good bread into the garbage. Good bread, white bread, not the sawdust and chaff we ate at home. These regulations about over-preparing seemed like madness to me. In Germany, there would be an investigation. Someone would be punished for such waste. Someone would go hungry while that bread was thrown away. Here it was just standard procedure, evidence of such abundance that waste was inevitable." The psychological impact of this food waste on German prisoners cannot be overstated. They had been conditioned by years of rationing to view food as precious beyond measure. The idea that an industrial nation could casually discard bread, meat, and produce, that it was standard military protocol to prepare more than needed, suggested a wealth so staggering that it undermined every assertion the Nazi regime had made about American economic weakness. Many German officers, by contrast, were not required to work under the Geneva Convention. Officers could choose to work or spend their time in camps. Some, particularly hardcore Nazi officers, refused to work, seeing it as beneath their status. They spent their days in the camps observing American efficiency, reading American newspapers, talking with American guards. For many, this idle observation of American prosperity proved even more demoralizing than labor, because they had nothing to distract them from confronting the reality of American power. The recreational facilities in the camps also shocked the prisoners. Libraries with thousands of books, many of them German literature, including books banned in Nazi Germany. The Americans distributed works by Erich Maria Remarque, Thomas Mann, and other degenerate authors whose works Hitler had condemned. Camp orchestras performed classical music, theater groups put on performances, sports facilities existed for prisoners to exercise and maintain morale. Working and Watching America, the labor program, experience. By September 1943, a labor shortage in American agriculture led to the employment of POWs across the country. This decision, driven by practical necessity, would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any propaganda program could have achieved. The decision seemed risky to some Americans, allowing enemy prisoners to work outside camps, to see American infrastructure, to interact with American civilians. Wouldn't this create security problems? In fact, the opposite occurred. The more prisoners saw, the more they understood the futility of Nazi resistance. Escape attempts were remarkably rare. Out of over 371,000 German POWs held in American camps, only 2,222 even attempted escape, less than 0.6%. And of those, none successfully remained free. Most were recaptured within 24 hours, many having realized within hours that escape was pointless. Where could they go? American territory was endless. American patrols were efficient, and increasingly prisoners realized they had it better as prisoners than they would have had if they'd remained in the German army. Groups of prisoners were trucked daily to work sites, traveling through the American heartland, without blindfolds or restricted routes. They were expected to see. The theory, apparently, was that witnessing American prosperity would be more effective than any security measures, and it proved true. They saw everything. The endless fields of corn and wheat stretching to the horizon, the factories running 3 shifts, their windows glowing at all hours, the shops full of goods, consumer goods that Germans hadn't seen in years, refrigerators, radios, automobiles, parking lots full of cars, houses with electric lights in every room, with running water, with indoor plumbing, luxuries that rural Germans had only dreamed of. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Unteroffizier Herbert Lang watched a single machine process more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could have handled in a month, using traditional methods. The scale of mechanization was mind-bending. In Germany, cotton processing still relied heavily on manual labor. The gin was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a massive rural electrification program that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The farmer who owned the gin was nobody special, Lang recorded in detail. Not aristocracy, not a Nazi party member, just a farmer. Yet he had electricity running through his farmhouse. He had running water pumped by electric motors. He had a truck for hauling goods. He had a car for personal transport. He had a tractor for farming. His workers, including the Negroes, and I have to record this despite what we were taught about racial theory, they were eating lunch from boxes containing more food than German workers received in a week. And this was normal. Every farm we passed was the same. This last point was critical. Nazi ideology had taught that a nation could only maintain power through rigid racial hierarchies and rigid class structures. Yet here was an American farmer employing African Americans in positions of responsibility, providing them with meals equivalent to what German workers received as weekly rations. The system was supposed to be unstable, according to Nazi theory. Yet it obviously worked. It produced abundance. In Nebraska, prisoners worked in sugar beet fields, witnessing agricultural mechanization that defied comprehension. A single combine harvester could do the work of 100 men. The machines rolled through fields with mechanical precision, harvesting, threshing, and bagging crops automatically. The fields themselves stretched to the horizon. American farmers spoke casually of yields that would have been fantasy in Germany. 60 bushels of wheat per acre compared to Germany's 30 bushels on the best land. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a farm outside Scottsbluff, recorded his shock in astonished detail. The farmer's son, a boy of perhaps 16 years old, drove a tractor that cost more than everything my father had earned in his entire lifetime of work. I said this to the boy. He laughed and said the tractor wasn't even particularly good. His father was waiting for a new model from John Deere that would be even better. Better than this marvel. I could not comprehend it. These were not isolated observations. They were repeated across dozens of prisoner accounts. American agricultural machinery was not just superior, it was being replaced with newer, even better models. The rate of technological advancement, the casual attitude toward replacing perfectly functional equipment with newer versions. All of this suggested an economy of such abundance that it violated German understanding of economic reality. Witnessing industrial production at peak capacity. The most devastating revelations came to those prisoners who worked near or in American factories. While Geneva Convention rules prohibited direct war production work, POWs could work in industries that freed American workers for military production. This technicality allowed thousands of German prisoners to witness American industrial capacity firsthand. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners watched production lines that processed more tomatoes in a single day than most German factories handled in a month. The facility operated with a skeleton crew of women and elderly men, as most young workers were in the military. Yet production exceeded peacetime levels. Everything was automated, documented Stabsgefreiter Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a German food processing plant before the war. Electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, steam cookers that processed hundreds of cans simultaneously. One elderly woman monitored controls that managed what would have required 50 workers in Germany. She did this while listening to a radio and drinking coffee. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading. Coal at a power plant gained glimpses of the automotive industry's conversion to war production. The River Rouge complex, visible across the water, employed 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, more than the entire city of Hamburg. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners unloaded steel that would become landing craft for D-Day. They watched workers assemble 700 boats per month, each requiring 20,000 parts. The factory employed 20,000 workers, including thousands of women who operated cranes, welded hulls, and managed production lines. Women doing men's work, Negroes operating complex machinery, teenagers running drilling equipment, wrote Stabsgefreiter Kurt Zimmermann. Everything we were told was impossible in a democracy. Yet production never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. They produced more boats in a month than our entire Navy built in a year. At Hay, Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed the production of 10,000 tons of steel daily. The blast furnaces ran continuously, fed by endless trains of iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. This single plant produced more steel than the entire Ruhr at its peak, wrote Obergefreiter Paul Hartmann, who had worked at Krupp before the war. I worked at Krupp before the war. I thought I understood industrial production, but this was beyond imagination. They wasted more steel in spillage than we could produce. The psychological transformation begins. By winter 1943, American intelligence officers began documenting what they called ideological collapse syndrome among the prisoners. The Special Projects Division, a secret re-education program run by the Provost Marshal General's Office, documented increasing numbers of prisoners requesting access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Noland, a member of the monitoring team, reported in December 1943, "The prisoners no longer argue when shown production statistics. They have seen too much. The most fanatical Nazis have become quiet. They still maintain loyalty to Germany, but no longer speak of victory. Many openly question what they were told about America." Camp newspapers, carefully monitored by American authorities, began reflecting this transformation. De Roof, The Call, published at Fort Kearny in Rhode Island, gradually shifted from defiant nationalism to discussions of democracy, economic systems, and post-war reconstruction. Editors, carefully selected as anti-Nazi prisoners, found their audience increasingly receptive. Lieutenant Hermann Gutz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter that passed American censors, "We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, controlled by Jews, incapable of military prowess. Every day I am here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. We were told fairy tales by criminals." The most devastating blow to Nazi ideology, however, came from an unexpected source: the betrayal of the Italians and the kindness of the enemy. After Italy's surrender in September 1943, Italian prisoners who agreed to cooperate were formed into Italian service units, given better quarters, increased pay, and more freedom. German prisoners watched their former allies working alongside Americans, eating in American restaurants, some even dating American women. Headman Friedrich Schultz wrote, "The Italians betrayed us, yet they are treated better than we treated them as allies. They work freely, earn money, send packages home. The Americans show them no hatred. This democracy we were taught to despise appears more honorable than our own system." Christmas 1943, the final breaking point. Christmas 1943 provided the most profound psychological impact. American organizations, churches, and civic groups sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German POWs, enemies who had been trying to kill American soldiers just months earlier. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. Local communities invited prisoners to Christmas dinners, though regulations prevented most from accepting. At Camp Hearn in Texas, the local Methodist church choir performed Christmas carols in German for the prisoners. Women from Hearn sent in homemade cookies and cakes. The Boy Scouts delivered handmade Christmas cards. This kindness toward enemies shattered the final remnants of Nazi racial theory. Oberfuhrer Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Many have sons and husbands fighting against our armies. Yet they show us Christian charity, not propaganda, but genuine kindness. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those absolutely certain of victory and secure in their power." The Christmas feast itself defied comprehension. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, ice, cream. quantities of food that Germany hadn't seen since before the First World War. "We ate like kings," wrote Feldwebel Hansa. "Better than German generals eat, better than party leaders." And this was not special. The guards told us this was a normal American Christmas dinner, that every American family was eating the same meal. If they can feed prisoners this way, what must their own soldiers eat? The Reeducation and the newspaper Der Ruf. By early 1944, over 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in educational programs. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and sciences. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses. Stanford University sent professors to lecture on democracy and economics. The thirst for knowledge was insatiable. Prisoners who had been told Americans were culturally barbaric discovered libraries with millions of books. They discovered universities that welcomed all social classes. They witnessed scientific research that led the world. They read American newspapers freely, comparing multiple viewpoints, something impossible in Nazi Germany. At Fort Kearny in Rhode Island, a secret re-education program had been established with the publication of Der Ruf, a newspaper entirely written and produced by carefully selected anti-Nazi prisoners. The publication was distributed to approximately 140 other POW camps across the United States. The newspaper included accurate accounts of the progress of the war, descriptions of the American political system, history of free German labor unions, and quotations from American authors like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, Walt Whitman, and Thornton Wilder. It was sold to prisoners for a nickel, not presented as American propaganda, but offered as a commodity prisoners had to choose to purchase. Some hardcore Nazis burned copies and threatened prisoners who bought them, calling it Jewish propaganda. But at many camps, the newspaper was met with enthusiasm, officers found, themselves receiving hundreds of letters praising the work. Hamann Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later wrote, "American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without hatred. They spoke of science as universal, belonging to all humanity. They were years ahead of German research, and they shared knowledge with enemies." This generosity of spirit was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi ideology. The camp theaters showed American films, not propaganda, but regular Hollywood productions. Prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, seeing a depiction of American defeat and recovery that resonated with their own situation. They saw The Grapes of Wrath, amazed that Americans would show such self-criticism to enemies. "They hide nothing," wrote Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. "They show their problems, their failures, their conflicts. Yet this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker." In Germany, such criticism would mean death. Here it is considered patriotic. The re-education program at Fort Kearny was remarkable because of its scale and ambition. Der Ruf was carefully curated. The editors selected not for their propaganda value, but for their intellectual capability and their anti-Nazi sentiments. The newspaper became remarkably popular, so popular, in fact, that printings had to be increased multiple times to meet demand. The staff of Der Ruf included intellectuals and writers, some of whom had suffered under Nazi persecution. Alfred Andersch, who would become a leading literary figure in post-war Germany, worked as an editor. He had been imprisoned in Dachau before being forced into the army, and he had deserted when captured by the Americans. Hans Werner Richter, another future prominent German writer, also worked on the publication. These men understood that they were part of something important, an effort to provide information and intellectual stimulation to fellow prisoners who were beginning to question the Nazi ideology they'd been taught. One prisoner, Kurt Vince, who served as production editor, wrote, "Had we only had the opportunity to read these books before, our introduction to life, to war, and the expanse of politics would have been different." He was referring to the banned German literature now available to prisoners, works by Erich Maria Remarque, Thomas Mann, and other authors the Nazi regime had condemned as degenerate. Now, in an American POW camp, these books circulated freely. The irony was not lost on the prisoners. The newspaper program was secret for a reason. Many in the American military opposed it, believing that it violated the spirit of the Geneva Convention, which prohibited exposing prisoners to propaganda. There was also concern that if the German government learned about American efforts to deprogram German soldiers, they might retaliate against American prisoners held in German camps. But the program continued, carefully documented, secretly celebrated when it succeeded. By March 1945, an assessment of 44 camp newspapers found that only 3 were anti-Nazi, 7 were non-political, and 25 were Nazi in character. By the fall of 1945, through the combined effects of re-education efforts, the realization that the war was lost, and prisoner interactions with Americans, a dramatic change had occurred. 24 newspapers had a democratic tendency, 18 were strongly anti-Nazi, 32 were non-political, and only 3 remained camouflaged Nazi or militaristic in orientation. At Camp Kearney itself, the prisoners who worked on Der Roof were in a unique position. They were selected anti-Nazis, treated differently from other prisoners, given access to American culture and American civilians working at the camp. They lived better than ordinary prisoners, received better food, had more freedom. But they also bore a responsibility. They understood they were creating something for thousands of fellow prisoners scattered across the United States. The program expanded after Germany's surrender in May 1945. The Army Provost Marshal's office established intensive re-education courses where selected prisoners participated in 6-day to 60-day programs on democracy and American government. These were not indoctrination efforts, but educational programs that treated prisoners as intelligent adults capable of understanding complex political and economic systems. By the war's end, over 25,000 prisoners had participated in formal re-education courses. The results surprised even the program's skeptics. Prisoners who had arrived as fanatical Nazis were writing essays about democratic reconstruction. Officers who had sworn oaths to Hitler were planning how to implement American agricultural and industrial methods in post-war Germany. The testimony of D-Day, June 6, 1944. When news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps, German prisoners experienced their final ideological collapse. The scale of the operation: 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave, demonstrated American organizational capacity beyond Nazi Germany's wildest dreams. Prisoners at Camp Shelby watched newsreels of the invasion within days. They saw the endless streams of ships, the artificial harbors, the supply system that delivered 15,000 tons daily across open beaches. They watched their homeland being crushed by the very nation they had been told was too weak to fight. "We knew then that everything was lost," wrote Hauptmann Friedrich von Tauben, "not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial mythology. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, courage against their unlimited resources." The transformation continues. Throughout their captivity, German prisoners experienced something that challenged Nazi ideology more than any material: wealth, American humanity. Despite propaganda depicting Americans as weak and sentimental, POWs discovered a people secure enough in their strength to show mercy. When Gefreiter Hans Miller's son died in the Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife wrote that she was struggling to feed their children, American church groups sent food packages to her in Germany. Enemy civilians in a nation America was actively bombing. "They separated the German people from the Nazi regime," wrote Hedman Otto. "They said they were fighting Hitler, not Germans." This distinction, which seemed like propaganda, proved genuine. They prepared us to rebuild Germany after the war, not to destroy it. Spring 1944. Expanded labor programs and maximum industrial capacity. Spring 1944 brought expanded prisoner labor programs as American production reached its peak. German POWs worked in canneries, mills, and fabrication plants, witnessing the full might of American industrial capacity operating at maximum efficiency. The numbers told a story that no propaganda could counter. The American military realized that every prisoner working outside camps, every prisoner witnessing American productivity, every prisoner coming into contact with American workers and their standard of living, was an argument against Nazism more powerful than any speech or pamphlet. German prisoners contributed over 14 million man-days of labor during the war. They processed 100 million board feet of lumber. Their total labor was valued at approximately $230 million in 1940s currency. Yet the financial value paled in comparison to the psychological value of having these prisoners witness firsthand what American economic capability looked like. In New Orleans, at the Higgins Boat Factory, prisoners unloaded steel that would become landing craft for D-Day. They watched workers assemble 700 boats per month, each one requiring 20,000 individual parts. The factory employed 20,000 workers, including thousands of women who operated cranes, welded hulls, and managed complex production lines. This was not an anomaly or a special war production facility. It was standard American manufacturing. Women doing men's work, Negroes operating complex machinery, teenagers running drilling equipment, wrote Stabsgefreiter Kurt Zimmerman. Everything we were told was impossible in a democracy. Yet production never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. They produced more boats in a month than our entire Navy built in a year. This observation cut to the heart of Nazi ideology. The Nazi regime had taught that democracies were weak, that they were divided by class and race conflict, that women could not perform skilled work, that allowing racial minorities to operate complex machinery would result in inferior products. Yet here was irrefutable evidence that the opposite was true. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed the production of 10,000 tons of steel daily. The blast furnaces ran continuously, fed by endless trains of iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. This single plant produced more steel than the entire Ruhr at its peak, wrote Obergefreiter Paul Hartmann, who had worked at Krupp before the war. They wasted more steel in spillage than we could produce. The summer 1944 harvest provided the final demolition of Nazi propaganda about American weakness. German prisoners worked across the Midwest, witnessing agricultural production that could feed the world. In Kansas, they watched wheat harvests, where single farms produced more grain than entire German provinces. Combines moved across fields like ships across an ocean of gold, each one harvesting 100 acres per day. One American farmer with machinery does the work of 100 German farmers, wrote Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia. They showed me aerial photographs of the wheat fields, thousands of square miles of grain. They could lose half their harvest and still have more than all of Europe combined. In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards that stretched beyond the horizon. They watched as perfectly good fruit was discarded for minor blemishes. Entire crops were sometimes plowed under to maintain prices, a practice that caused psychological breakdown among prisoners from hunger-ravaged Germany. They destroyed food to keep prices stable, wrote Gefreiter Otto Schultz. Mountains of oranges bulldozed into pits because they had too many. We begged to be allowed to send them to Germany to our families. The waste was strategic proof of unlimited resources. The statistics of success and the spring 1944 brought expanded prisoner labor programs as American production reached its peak. German POWs worked in canneries, mills, and fabrication plants, witnessing the full might of American industrial capacity. The numbers told a story that no propaganda could counter. Between 1943 and 1945, German prisoners worked 14 million man-days in agricultural labor. They processed 100 million board feet of lumber. Their labor was valued at approximately $230 million in 1940s currency. They were paid 80 cents daily in camp scrip, money they could spend in the canteen but couldn't use for escape attempts. In Kansas, they watched wheat harvests, where single farms produced more grain than entire German provinces. Combines moved across fields like ships across an ocean of gold, each one harvesting 100 acres per day. The grain elevators they filled could hold more wheat than Germany imported in an entire year. One American farmer with machinery does the work of 100 German farmers, wrote Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia. They showed me aerial photographs of the wheat fields, thousands of square miles of grain. They could lose half their harvest and still have more than all of Europe combined. In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards that stretched beyond the horizon. They watched as perfectly good fruit was discarded for minor blemishes, fruit that would have been treasured in Germany. Entire crops were sometimes plowed under to maintain prices, a concept that caused psychological breakdown among prisoners from hunger-ravaged Germany. They destroyed food to keep prices stable, wrote Gefreiter Otto Schultz. Mountains of oranges bulldozed into pits because they had too many. We begged to be allowed to send them to Germany to our families. The guards were sympathetic but explained it was impossible. The waste was strategic proof of unlimited resources. The remarkable success of the program. By March 1945, the secret re-education program had produced remarkable results. Over 25,000 prisoners had volunteered for democracy courses. Camp newspapers published articles about constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Discussion groups debated Germany's future after the war. Prisoners who had arrived as fanatical Nazis were writing essays about democratic reconstruction. Officers who had sworn oaths to Hitler were planning how to implement American agricultural methods in post-war Germany. "We became missionaries for democracy," admitted Obst Hermann Gutz, no relation to the Reich Marshal, in a 1975 interview. "Not through coercion or propaganda, but through observation. We saw it work. We saw ordinary people living better than German aristocracy. We wanted that for Germany." The transformation was so complete that American authorities actually worried about prisoners being too enthusiastic about American ways. Some requested to stay in America after the war. Others married American women they met through prison correspondence programs. Thousands would eventually immigrate to America in the 1950s. The horror and the final reckoning. April 1945 brought the final revelation. As American forces liberated concentration camps in Germany, the footage was shown to German POWs. Many refused to believe it initially, claiming it was propaganda, but the evidence was overwhelming. Testimony from American soldiers, photographs, newsreels, and eventually letters from Germany confirming the horror. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had maintained some pride in German honor despite military defeat now faced the complete moral collapse of their nation. Everything they had fought for was not just defeated, but evil. Headman Walter Schmidt wrote the most eloquent summary. "We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. We found that we were the barbarians. The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what civilization actually meant." The return home and the legacy that shaped a nation. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German POWs were repatriated from American camps. The process was gradual, systematic, and remarkably well organized. Beginning in November 1945, the former prisoners were returned to Europe at a rate of $50,000 a month. Most were initially assigned to help rebuild war-damaged France and Britain before their ultimate return to Germany. They returned to a Germany divided, destroyed, and destitute. Cities had been bombed relentlessly. The economy was shattered. The government structure had collapsed. German agriculture was devastated. Industrial capacity had been destroyed by bombing. The psychological state of the nation was one of shock and despair. Yet these returning prisoners brought with them something precious: knowledge of how a democratic industrial society functioned. As the POWs left Texas by the trainload, the camps began to close. The vast infrastructure that had been built to house and process these men was dismantled. In Herne, the campsite and its 200 buildings were put up for public auction. In the 1980s, the space comprised a small municipal airport and proposed industrial park. The camp in Huntsville became part of Sam Houston State Teachers College. In Mexia, Camp Mexia became the site of a state facility. At Camp Swift in Bastrop, the grounds later comprised scattered housing developments, a University of Texas Cancer Research Center, and other facilities. The German POWs who experienced American prosperity became unwitting agents of transformation in post-war Germany. They had seen industrial efficiency, agricultural productivity, and democratic prosperity. They knew Reconstruction was possible because they had witnessed a society that had achieved it. Many German soldiers, both officers and enlisted men, had been profoundly changed by their captivity. They no longer believed in Nazi ideology. They no longer believed in German racial superiority. They had experienced kindness from enemies. They had seen superior systems in operation. Many former POWs rose to prominence in West Germany's Reconstruction. Hans Kroll, prisoner at Camp Shelby who had witnessed American industrial might firsthand, became West German ambassador to the United States. He would serve in this role for years, representing Germany in the country, that had once held him prisoner, now building an alliance with the former enemy nation. Walter Hallstein, who participated in re-education programs and taught classes at Camp Koch in Kenya Roveri Morikane Painkori, became president of the European Commission, the executive body of the European Union. He was instrumental in building European unity, bringing together nations that had been bitter enemies just years earlier. His vision for European integration, influenced by his experience of American democratic and economic systems, helped create one of the most successful international unions in history. Rüdiger von Weckmar, held at Camp Herne, served as German permanent representative to the United Nations. Edward Ackerman, prisoner at Fort Robinson, became a leader in German agricultural reform, bringing American farming methods and efficiency to German agriculture. Heinrich Böll, a future Nobel Prize winner in literature who had been a POW in America, wrote extensively about his transformation and the lessons learned in captivity. These men and women brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, American democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, of the 1950s was built partly on knowledge gained in American prison camps. The rapid industrialization and agricultural modernization of West Germany during the 1950s used American models, American technology transfer, and American capital through the Marshall Plan. We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest, Hans Kroll wrote in his memoirs. We saw that democracy created wealth, that diversity brought strength, that treating workers well increased production. These lessons learned as prisoners shaped the new Germany. Yet the returning prisoners became voices for democracy in a nation that was being divided. In West Germany, which would soon emerge as a democratic nation aligned with the Western powers, returned prisoners became teachers, engineers, farmers, factory managers, and political leaders. They brought American democratic principles because they had lived under those principles, had experienced their benefits firsthand. In East Germany, which fell under Soviet control, prisoners returned with different experiences and faced different fates. Some were purged by Soviet authorities who viewed American-influenced Germans with suspicion. But even there, the knowledge carried by returned prisoners about American industrial capacity, about democratic systems, about alternative ways of organizing society, would eventually contribute to the destabilization of communist rule decades later. The transformation wrought by the American POW camp experience was so significant that historians have argued it may have prevented a Third World War, a Germany occupied entirely by Soviet forces without the democratic tradition that emerged from West Germany might have created very different Cold War dynamics. The fact that millions of Germans had relatives or knew people who had been treated decently by Americans, who had witnessed American prosperity, who believed that recovery and prosperity through democracy was possible, this created a different psychological foundation for post-war Germany than might otherwise have existed. The statistics that tell the story. The German POW experience in America is one of the most successful re-education programs in history. Without coercion, without propaganda in the traditional sense, American industrial might and democracy converted hardened Nazis into future democratic citizens. Over 500 camps across 45 states held prisoners. Camps were built with an average construction time of 90 days. Over 14 million man-days of agricultural labor were provided. Less than 1% of 371,000 German POWs attempted escape. Only 2,122 escape attempts recorded, with 0 successful permanent escapes. No American civilians were harmed by escaped POWs. 40,000 prisoners enrolled in educational courses. 135 camp newspapers were published. 30,000 took English classes. 15,000 received vocational training. 8,000 participated in university correspondence courses. By war's end, surveys showed that 95% of German POWs rated their treatment as good or excellent. 74% reported that captivity positively changed their worldview. 61% expressed interest in learning about democracy. Less than 10% maintained strong Nazi beliefs by 1945. Most remarkably, thousands maintained correspondence with American families for decades after the war. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, surviving German POWs held a reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former prisoners returned to America, many bringing their families, the voices of those who were there. Former Obergefreiter Hans Wehe, held at Fort Robinson and who later became a physician in Georgetown, Maine, spoke at the reunion. Life in the camps was a vast improvement for many of us who had grown up in cold water flats in Germany. We discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food. But more than that, we discovered dignity. Former Stabsgefreiter Kurt Meir, who had worked on farms in Iowa, added, "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared their meals, their knowledge, sometimes their homes. This humanity from people whose sons were fighting against us. This changed us forever." At the 1985 reunion dinner, former Obst Hermann Gutz, then 78 years old, delivered the keynote address that captured the essence of the transformation. We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from production, not from hatred, but from diversity, not from tyranny, but from freedom. We witnessed the arsenal of democracy at full production. We saw farmers who produced food for the world, workers who built the tools of victory, and citizens who treated enemies with dignity. We learned that America's true weapon was not its bombs or tanks, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and its unshakable confidence. We returned to Germany with a mission to build a society that could create rather than destroy, that could prosper through peace rather than war. The Germany that rose from the ashes was built on lessons learned in American prison camps. We who came as conquerors left as students. Thank you to America from your former enemies, now your friends. Thank you for showing us the way. The auditorium erupted in standing ovation. Americans and Germans together, former enemies united in recognition of a transformation that had seemed impossible when those first trains rolled into Texas in June 1943. The profound truth. The German POW experience in America proved something fundamental about human nature and about what democracies can achieve. The most powerful weapon in America's arsenal was not military might, though that was certainly formidable. It was the simple, overwhelming evidence of a free society's capacity to create abundance. Every full meal was an argument against Nazism. Every electric light was a counter to propaganda. Every working toilet was evidence of a system that cared for the dignity of all people, even enemies. The prisoners were converted not through clever rhetoric or forced re-education, but through observation. They saw American society functioning at peak efficiency while treating enemies with dignity. They witnessed industrial capacity that made German production look primitive. They experienced a standard of living that exposed Nazi promises as fantasies. And in that transformation lay the seeds of Europe's post-war redemption and the final defeat of the Nazi dream. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany in the 1950s was built on foundations laid in American prison camps, where enemy soldiers learned that prosperity came not from conquest, but from freedom. Not from racial superiority, but from human dignity. Not from totalitarian control, but from democratic cooperation. Those German POWs had arrived in America expecting to find a weak, divided nation on the verge of collapse. Instead, they discovered an industrial colossus of unlimited power and surprising humanity. They had come as prisoners of war, but they left as witnesses to the arsenal of democracy at its absolute peak. Their story stands as testimony to a profound truth. Sometimes the greatest victories are won not through destruction, but through demonstration. Not through propaganda, but through prosperity. Not through hatred, but through humanity. The German POWs were stunned by America's industrial might, but, more importantly, they were changed by it. And in that change lay the foundation for a better world. Thank you so much for joining me on WW2 Tales. If you enjoyed this story of transformation and redemption in the midst of global conflict, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We have so many more forgotten stories from World War II waiting to be told. Stories of courage, of humanity, of how ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances. Leave a comment below and let me know which part of this story struck you most. Was it the shock of American abundance, the kindness shown to enemies, the successful re-education that changed the course of post-war history? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want to dive deeper into these stories, consider joining our community. New videos every week, exploring the forgotten corners of World War II history. Until next time, thank you for supporting WW2 Tales, and I'll see you in the next video.